everyone, welcome to all of you. So in last lecture we have discussed about structure of stamen, microsporangium, and yes, already we have discussed about microsporogenesis, right? So formation of pollen grain we have already discussed. So in this lecture we are going to learn about structure of pollen grain and its type. So as we all know that pollen grain, it is male, gametophyte, so it is male gamete. You can see in so many flower, for example hibiscus. So if you will touch that flower, so you can see so much pollen grain will be there. So this is hibiscus flower and there will be so much pollen grain in the part of anther, right? So whenever you take pollen grain and drop some water which contains some sucrose solution, right? So it is not only water, some sucrose solution. So you will find this type of germination of pollen grain, but you need to observe under microscope, right? So under naked eye you cannot you are not able to observe it. So under microscope you can see such a structure if you will put this pollen grain in a sucrose solution. So pollen grain varies, from species to species, like their size and shape and color. It is varies. You can see here there are so many diversity in pollen grain. Actually, structure of pollen grain there are two layer in structure of pollen grain. Outer layer it is known as a exine and inner layer known as a intine. Size of pollen grain it is up to 25 to 50 micrometer. And as I told you, this exine layer actually it is made up of sporopollenin and it is so much hard. It can be high temperature and strong acid and alkali. For example, it can tolerate so much extreme environment or so much extreme either temperature or acidity, and no enzyme that degrades sporopollenin. Again, there is no enzyme which is able to degrade this sporopollenin, and pollen grain exine has a prominent aperture called germ pore. So from this germ pore, actually this germ pore where this sporopollenin is absent, so it is known as a germ pore, and this germ pore will be provide door for the germination of pollen tube. Actually pollen tube is germinate from the intine layer, right? So don't get confused, but this germ pore will provide door for the germinating pollen tube, right? So this is exine and this is intine, and the exine exhibit a fascinating array of pattern and design. So some question it is asking to you, why do you think the exine should be hard? It should be, right? Because it is not hard, so there is get chance to destroy of that some genetic material which is which is present inside. So what is the function of germ pore? We have discussed about it. Now intine, it is the innermost layer and it is made up of cellulose and pectin, right? So cytoplasm of pollen grain is surrounded by plasma membrane, and there are two type of cell inside this pollen grain. We can see this is the maturation period of pollen grain. So there are two type of cell, one is vegetative and one is generative cell. So generative cell, it is smaller than the vegetative cell, and generative cell floats in the cytoplasm of that vegetative cell. So it is spindle shaped with a dense cytoplasm and a nucleus, and in most of the species, for example over 60% of angiosperm, these pollen grain are shed at two cell stage. So one is vegetative and one is generative, but in rest of the species, for example in 40% species, this generative cell will divide, right? So it will become two cell. So in rest of the species, this pollen grain sheds at three cell stage, we can say. So MCQ may be asked from this portion, in how many species pollen grain sheds at two cell stage and sheds at three cell stage. So hope that makes sense and you need to remember that, right? So there are so many pollen grain which are responsible for the allergies and bronchial infection. You can see here, there are so many pollen grain species. Actually this carrot grass and parthenium, it came with the import of that wheat. So pollen grain are rich in nutrient, and there are so many person who using this pollen grain for the purpose of their nutrition. it has become a fashion in recent year to use pollen tablet as food supplement, especially in Western countries. People are using pollen grain in the form of tablet and in the form of syrup. So you can see here, this is the various tablet and this is syrup of pollen grain. Actually, they believe, it is helping them for their performance. Actually, especially this athlete person are believing this, that pollen grain will be helpful for their good performance. That's the reason they are using such pollen grain. So when once they are shed, pollen grain have to land on stigma before they lose viability. So what do you think, how long do that pollen grain retain viability? So it is varies from species to species. For example, in case of rice and in case of wheat, viability, it is the actual period of that viability, it is 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes it will degrade or die. So in case of Rosenaceae, Leguminosaceae, Solanaceae, viability of that pollen grain, it is up to 1 month. So it is varies from species to species, right? So you may have heard about storing of sperm cell or semen in case of artificial insemination. Now what is artificial insemination? Actually, artificially sperm, it is get inserted inside a female reproductive tract, so it is known as artificial insemination. Although we will be having look on chapter number about this in chapter number 8. So pollen grain also we can store you know in liquid nitrogen around -193 degree temperature. So again you need to remember this thing. Such a stored pollen grain can be used as a pollen bank, similar to seed bank and crop breeding program. So we can also store this pollen grain and can be used as a pollen bank. So whenever you need to necessary of that pollen grain, so you can go such pollen bank and you can get it. So these are some types of pollen grain. Like in some species, pollen grain sheds at a one, there will be only one pollen grain, means there is no any fusion of pollen grain. So in some cases pollen grain sheds at two, because two pollen grain are fused with each other. So you can say this is monad, this is dyad, and vice versa. And there are some pollen grain, especially in case of pinus, there will be a such pollen grain which have such wings, so it can float on the air easily. In case of symmetry, there are so many types. You can see this A and B, it has a radial symmetry, and C and D, it has a bilateral symmetry. So what we have seen, I want to show you one animated video. So on the basis of that you can check. See, up to this what we have seen, you can see here, this is various floral parts. This is male reproductive organ, this is female reproductive organ, androecium, gynoecium, sepal, this is petal, you can say. So stamen, carpel, and this is filament, this is anther. So in anther there will be a pollen sac. So in this pollen sac, pollen microsporogenesis will be take place, and parental cell, microspore, mother cell, pollen mother cell we have seen. So it is diploid. By meiosis there will be a haploid, so tetrad. Each and every pollen grain has ploidy of haploid, right? So, and it is millions of pollen grain will be there. So there are two type of cell, vegetative and generative nucleus inside a one pollen grain. And this is the structure of pollen grain, you can see. And this is sporopollenin, we have already gone through. And this is cross section of pollen grain, in which we can see this is outer membrane, it is exine, and this is intine. So from this intine, actually pollen tube, it is going to form or going to germinate. And after maturation of this pollen grain, it will this anther will be burst and pollen grain will be come out from it. You can see here pollen grain, it is coming out from this anther. Alright, so this was all about pollen grain. I hope this video may be helpful to you. If you like this video, so kindly subscribe this channel and share with your friends. Thank you.